How we doing, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Richie Hicks Jr. Sports Podcast. It is Super Bowl week, and with every Super Bowl, there is a story. And tonight, the story is about some of the greatest teams that didn't win the Super Bowl. There is always an extra story. NFL Network has gone deep into certain shows like The Missing Rings, which chronicled the Buffalo Bills. We've had stories about Tony Romo on NFL Network on some of his heartbreaks in the playoffs, other players like him. And tonight, we are hitting on 15 teams, 5 which qualify for our honorable mention list, and our 10 best teams that didn't win the Super Bowl in their respective years. We are going to start with our honorable mentions. Coming in at number 5, we've got the 1986 Cleveland Browns. The drive by John Elway, which followed the fumble by Ernest Biner, prevented the Browns' first Super Bowl appearance. They have yet to get to a Super Bowl. This was many, many years ago where they had this opportunity. Zappy, your thoughts on this team and where we put them?
Well, I mean, it's like you said, the Ernest Biner fumble. The Browns were set up. They were at the 8-yard line. They needed 6 yards for a first down. Obviously, 8 for the touchdown. Bernie Kosar hands him off the ball. He's got the first down and sees a little more that he wants. And because of the extra effort, he ends up fumbling the ball, and which led to the orchestrated drive that everyone will always remember by John Elway. So it's like, I think that one was one of the ones that needed to be on there because of the circumstance at hand, and that fumble just let the game slip away.
Yeah, the Browns were on a collision course with the New York Giants had they held on. Ultimately, the Giants defeated the Broncos 39-20 in that particular Super Bowl. It's a big game in Cleveland history because of the fact that there was so much misery that followed over the years. Bill Belichick, about a decade later, coached them. They ultimately ended up moving out of Cleveland, came back 4 or 5 years later. Since then, they have a playoff win. Back in the 2020 pandemic season, a road playoff win over the Pittsburgh Steelers. But you talk about misery, multiple quarterbacks, never getting the right answers. This particular 86 team haunts Cleveland fans because Cleveland fans view it as the team that should have made the Super Bowl.
Yeah, man. And I mean, the other thing about it, as much as, Cleveland is back, for these fans who watch the Baltimore Ravens win multiple Super Bowls, when this is the team that left Cleveland, if you really look at it, So it's just, anyways.
It's been tough for them. At number 4, a team that was formerly in the AFC, moving over to the NFC, we have the 2015 Seattle Seahawks. This was a team that was the defending champions, attempting to go back-to-back, playing against the team that was in the process of maybe getting their own dynasty, but then again, Seattle has had a way to say something about it. In one of the most peculiar, controversial calls in the history of the game, Russell Wilson throws a pick while they are literally on the doorstep of New England's end zone. And many question that this was intentional because of the fact that Marshawn Lynch was not making any friends during the media week, repeatedly saying, "I'm here so I won't get fined," essentially telling the media that he really didn't trust them and didn't want to speak to them or open up to them about much of anything. Yeah, this undeniably one of the worst Super Bowl play calls in ever.
I don't care if I'm Pete Carroll and Marshawn slept with my wife the night before. I'm giving them the ball. We're gonna win the Super Bowl, and
Well,
I'll
if
deal
you
with
look
the
at
other
true
stuff later.
champions, taking it back to Cleveland for a second, you look at Roger Dorn and Rick Wilding Vaughn. They were able to put that to the side for the greater good
That's right. And
of defeating
it's just
the Jack Parkman and the hated White Sox.
with that little shoulder shrug right before he went at bat.
This little shimmy makes
His
the
little
women
shimmy.
here in Cleveland sick. But anyway, back to
Yeah,
Seattle.
it's you run the ball. The Super Bowl's there. You run the ball. It's that simple. Why are you dropping back to pass when you have Marshawn Lynch?
And
He's right there.
situationally,
This is
you watch America's game on the Patriots. Situationally, this is something that they prepared for all the way back in the preseason, in training camp. Malcolm Butler, Super Bowl hero, makes the play, and essentially Russell Wilson missed out on joining a short list of guys who have won 2 or more, and that's what the Seahawks lost here. They have not been back to the Super Bowl since, but they did miss their opportunity to go back to back. The previous year, they defeated the Denver Broncos in MetLife Stadium in essentially the first time where the elements played a factor in a Super Bowl. I mean, we have seen rain in a Super Bowl. That did happen once before. But just the inclement weather the year before, in one of the biggest drubbings in Super Bowl history over Peyton Manning's Broncos. So this Seattle team, led by the Legion of Boom, one of the greatest secondaries in the history of the league. Yeah, they definitely missed here. They missed here. They had a chance to essentially go down in history with other teams, and they fall short of that, and that's why they're on this list. An honorable mention.
And it's crazy. The last point about Russell, yes, he would have gone in as one of the few quarterbacks to win 2, but he would have gone in with an even smaller list to have won back-to-back.
Yes. Joining Bart Starr, John Elway,
Terry Bradshaw twice, Troy Aikman,
Tom Brady.
And Tom Brady. Yeah.
Not too many. At number 4, another team that failed to go back-to-back, the 2008 New York Giants. Actually, they're number 3. What have I done here?
Yeah, you're right. We're on number 3 now.
Yeah, but I somehow managed to put them at number 4. Yeah, the 08 Giants, team's best start since 1990. This team had a road winning streak going all the way back to the previous year, 07, when they won the Super Bowl as a wild card. They carried that road winning streak into October of the next year. Their first loss of the year was to the Cleveland Browns. They went 10-1 over the first 11 games of 08. I think one of the craziest stats about this Giants team is that they defeated every team in the regular season that ultimately played in championship weekend. That being the Ravens, the Eagles, the Steelers, the Cardinals in championship weekend. Turning point of the year, undeniably. Fateful night out. Plaxico Burress shot himself in the Latin Quarter. Ultimately goes to prison for multiple years. New York, very zero tolerance on guns, bottom line. Mm-hmm. But the team didn't respond. The team really fell apart after that. They went from 11-1 to 12-4. They did win an all-important Week 17 game against the Carolina Panthers to guarantee themselves home field. But in the end, they lost to the Eagles in a very flat performance. They were missing Burris. It was obvious. And Eli Manning, we're talking about quarterbacks who could have won back-to-back. That was his opportunity and one that was missed. And, when you talk about during the Super Bowl, we talk about awards, we talk about Hall of Fame stuff too. It all links together. A lot of people think Eli's on the bubble. I'm not one of those people. I think he'll get in. I will say this, though. If he had 3 instead of 2, and if he had a back-to-back, there's nothing to talk about. And it cost Eli a chance to play against his draft mate, Ben Roethlisberger. That would have been interesting.
Yeah. I can't think of anything else to say about that 2018.
Good, because it still hurts.
I think you
At
covered
number
it all.
2, we've got the 1996 Denver Broncos. They lost to the 9-7 expansion Jaguars, only their second year of existence. Their head coach was Tom Coughlin. The Broncos were coached by Mike Shanahan. The Broncos ended up winning the Super Bowls each of the next 2 seasons. So if you look at this loss, essentially you could say they could have three-peated. 14-2 Broncos, mile high, losing to the 9-7 Jaguars. Your thoughts on this?
This is a team that if they win that game against Jacksonville, they likely go to the Super Bowl, and that is the start of their three-peat. You know, it was everything on the line for that team. They just got out-coached. Tom Coughlin showed up ready to coach his Jaguars that day, and he did. There's not much to say about it, just the fact that it could have been, you mentioned this, that it could have been the start of a three-peat for them.
Couple of side notes here. The Broncos did a drastic uniform change after this playoff loss. And this was also a win by Mark Brunell, who was in the expansion draft, formerly of Green Bay, backing up Brett Favre. And that was also a quarterback room that also had Kurt Warner. So you had 2 Hall of Famers and 1 very good quarterback. So interesting little fact there. Honorable mention number 1 before we move into our top 10 teams, your Dallas Cowboys of 94. Take it.
I mean, it's like you said, we're coming off to back-to-back Super Bowl wins. I didn't want to put this one here, but at the same time I did. This was one of the tough ones for me because it came down to this year and 2014 Dallas Cowboys. But as you know, you look at the leading into that season, the 49ers had came off of a really hard loss in the NFC title game to Dallas. So they went out there and they signed the player they needed to sign, that being Deion Sanders. And that was ultimately the difference, as we saw it in consecutive years, where Deion Sanders brought a Super Bowl to San Francisco, and he did make a difference out there, even though Irvin was kind of torching him at times. Irvin torched Deion when he was in Atlanta a lot, though. But, Dallas was going into that game looking for the three-peat, but it was just under Barry Switzer. That was, I believe, the ultimate difference. And we know what happened before that, after the Super Bowl, Jerry Jones firing Jimmy Johnson, the whole Jerry not getting the recognition that he thought he deserved when it was Jimmy that orchestrated this team from beginning to end. So we saw what happened to it. We lost to the 49ers. 49ers went on to win Super Bowl 29, and the rest is history.
Another thing with regard to this game, it's crazy because you have the very next year, the matchup that everyone wanted was Montana against Young. So this was not the year that people wanted the 49ers to beat the Cowboys. It was the next year, or I should say the previous year. This was the first year that the Buffalo Bills were not in the Super Bowl in 5 years. The first time in 5 years that they weren't. Niners beat their in-state, I wouldn't call it in-state rival, but another California team at the time in the San Diego Chargers. A real drubbing. This was essentially your Super Bowl, and many NFC title games during that era were essentially your Super Bowl. We are now going to talk about the top 10 teams who fell short of a Super Bowl victory. As I said, many stories. We're going to do one about winners. This one is about the losers. At number 10, the 1984 Miami Dolphins. Dan Marino had a historical season, fell short to Joe Montana and the Niners. On a side note, Ray Finkel, never mind.
Laces out. Yeah, the 84 Dolphins, I mean, all I think about is Dan Marino lost and made a promise that he just never followed through with. We'll be back. Year in and year out. I think the best receiver he ever saw was O.J. McDuffie. You know, Clayton
and Duper were good, but I don't know.
It's really hard to think about it, and they never gave this guy the opportunity to go get another one. It's like you're the best quarterback in this draft, so you're going to do it the way we want you to do it. Yeah, it was sad, man. They were a good team that year, but they just couldn't beat the Niners.
Over the years, it seemed like Dan Marino was on the wrong side of many a shootout. And never truly had a defense that was championship caliber until much later in his career. As a Cowboy fan, I think you could probably make a similar relation to what Tony Romo went through, where he didn't have that excellent defense until he was battered, bruised, and then when Dak kind of came about. But yes, many squandered seasons because of their inability to put together a great defense. Don Shula picked up a ton of wins with this team, but ultimately never got back to that glory of the 70s. At number 9, we're going to speak on a team that was in the process of potentially starting a dynasty, but they opened the door for a different dynasty. The greatest show on turf, the Rams at the time playing in St. Louis. This has a lot of things attached to it, this particular game. It was the 9/11 season. Years later, we find out that Spygate, this was like the beginning of some of that. At times, people have gone as far as saying, should we discredit what they did? I know Marshall Faulk for years, as a member of NFL Network, let it be known where he stood.
Mm-hmm.
But as the game goes, essentially the Patriots were on everything the Rams did in this game. The Rams did not really have success until they ditched the playbook. In 1999, the Rams had defeated the Tennessee Titans in one of the more thrilling Super Bowls. So they were trying to go for their second in 3 years and essentially start their own dynasty, or have a chance to. And this Patriot team, one of the bigger underdogs in the history of the Super Bowl. Tom Brady's first Super Bowl. There's not really much else to say. I mean, the first of 10 appearances for Tom Brady. Adam Vinatieri did what he did on that stage often. He kicked a game-winning field goal. Tom Brady showed the composure to bring them down the field. But when you look at this game on paper and you look at the rosters, this is truly a shocking victory, because the Patriots really did have a lot of no-names on that particular team. And not necessarily on defense, but on offense, there was a lot to be desired.
Yeah, it's I mean, the way I look at it too is that's when people realized that Bill Belichick was one hell of a defensive-minded coach, to be able to slow that greatest show on turf down. And it wasn't really till the fourth quarter where the Rams offensively got going. You know, you had the deep play to tie the game, and Marshall, of course, having his. This was a team that no one could stop them, no one. And then the writing was on the wall. Like you said, 9/11, the birth of a GOAT in a lot of people's eyes, the birth of the greatest head coach. There's just all the storylines that go with it. And then, like you said, Adam Vinatieri, the first of 3 game-winning drives that led to an Adam Vinatieri game-winning field goal. It was a hard one for the Rams, because I think that loss changed the whole trajectory of the team. Obviously, we saw a couple of years later where Mark Bulger comes in and takes over for Kurt Warner. And then we saw the eventual retirement of Isaac Bruce, Marshall Faulk, and it just never was the same after that. And not to mention, what's his name retiring, the head coach. I cannot think of his name right now.
Well, Dick Vermeil was actually out already. Vermeil left after 99. This was actually a team coached by Mike Martz.
That's what I mean. That's what I'm saying.
So
if Dick Vermeil was still there, yeah, I think they would have won.
This was a team that was trying to win with 2 different coaches, 3 different years. But yes, nothing was ever quite the same for the Rams. A couple of side notes with regard to the future. The Rams would later face the Patriots years later, 13-3. Defeat to the Patriots. Once again, another defensive showing for the New England Patriots. Completely different cast of characters, completely different players. But the Rams, And, Rams relocated to Los Angeles again, where they had originally started. And they did get a Super Bowl victory last year. We're going to move it along to the Baltimore Colts. I'll put it to you like this. I had an issue figuring out where I wanted to put this team and if they were good enough to make this list. But the reason why I ultimately did is because of the magnitude of the loss and what that loss brought. At the time, the AFL was not considered the same caliber of football as the NFL. This game brought about so many huge things. This is the first game that was actually termed the Super Bowl, even though they coined phrased 1 and 2 down the road, both won by the Green Bay Packers. This is the first Super Bowl won by the AFL. And this really drove the NFL into the entity that it is. Joe Namath with the famous guarantee. Key part of the game, Johnny Unitas was benched. Didn't come in until later. But a huge victory for the sport in terms of the expansion of it. And New York needed a winner. And it wasn't the Giants then. Giants were on some definite hard times during this era. The Jets have never been back to a Super Bowl since then. And this is 54 years ago.
Does Joe Namath's number 12 get retired if the Colts win that Super Bowl? I don't think so.
No, you're right. It doesn't. And it's funny. The big offseason story is if Aaron Rodgers is going to the Jets. He has been granted permission by Broadway Joe to bring the 12 out of retirement and wear it because obviously as many, or if not everyone knows, that is Aaron Rodgers' number in Green Bay. And he is linked to a potential trade to the Jets. Another team that is linked is the Raiders. We'll see how that goes. But as Baltimore goes, later moving to Indianapolis, winning a Super Bowl in Indianapolis with the great Peyton Manning. And Idris's cousin was on that team, Aaron Moorhead. So I think it's the magnitude ultimately of what this game meant. And in terms of the 60s, when you look at the many events, you have the Civil Rights Movement, you have the Vietnam War, you have the Beatles, but you also have Joe Namath. Joe Namath was a huge part of pop culture in the 60s. And, you had the Miracle Jets, more or less simultaneously to the Miracle Mets of 69 who beat the Baltimore Orioles. So very interesting. 2 New York dubs over Baltimore. I don't root for either team, but it had to be a hell of a time to experience it nonetheless. At number 7, we've got the Philadelphia Eagles. Let me get this ticker going. Kind of stymied for a second there.
Oh, I was wondering what was going on.
Yeah, Philadelphia Eagles of 2004. This was Terrell Owens' first of only 2, not even 2 full years. He was out the next season, suspended for team discipline reasons, behavior detrimental to the team. It all started here. It was brewing during the year. T.O. got hurt during the season in the game against the Dallas Cowboys. He was able to return in time for the Super Bowl playing on a bad leg. If the Philadelphia Eagles win this game, T.O. is your Super Bowl MVP undeniably. Ultimately, the MVP in this game was Deion Branch. And this was the Patriots' 3rd win in 4 years, just a few years after their big win over the Rams. But Donovan McNabb, in one of the most memorable or infamous, however you want to coin phrase it, vomiting during their most important drive of the game. I can honestly say I've never seen anything like that before.
I mean, you could look at Willie Beeman. That's about it.
Yeah, but that was a movie. And oddly enough,
exactly.
This is not the first time this happened to McNabb, but the friction that this caused between T.O. and McNabb ultimately caused the divorce. where they moved on from T.O. And I believe that T.O. took it personal because T.O. just looked at McNabb that he just wasn't prepared. Whereas T.O. went through hell to get ready for that game and really put his body on the line. So while narratives were made by the media, looking back at it and knowing what we know now, not only may T.O. have had a leg to stand on, no pun intended, I also think that perhaps the Eagles may have chosen the wrong guy to keep around.
Yeah, that's always going to be the argument, in my opinion. And I think it's, well, honestly, first of all, if the Eagles win that game, the Eagles might have been great for a little while because I think T.O. and McNabb would have had a great relationship together. You know, it's crazy that loss caused everything to just fall apart.
And I don't think it's that they lost. I think it's how they lost.
It's how they lost, exactly. But, yeah, I mean, the argument was, why did they draft Donovan McNabb over Ricky Williams? And then we go to this one. Why didn't they keep T.O. and let McNabb go? It's, you know, it's going to be there.
They were right about McNabb, but maybe not right about not keeping T.O. if one had to go. But, you know, quarterback-driven league, we get it. But ultimately, it's a case of what if, because there was a lot of what could have been. The Eagles did get their revenge on the Patriots years later. 2017 season, defeated the New England Patriots. But this was a tough one for the Eagles. And a little side note, this is the only time the New England Patriots won a Super Bowl against the NFC East team because they are 1-3, losing twice to the Giants and another time to the Eagles. So the NFC East has given the New England Patriots their share of problems. At number 6, we have the Green Bay Packers, 2011. Yeah, 15-1 team. They lost to the eventual champion Giants. This is a team that, once again, you talk about back-to-back. Similar to the man before him, Aaron Rodgers had a chance to accomplish the same feat, which would be winning multiple Super Bowls back-to-back in a row. Favre got to a second Super Bowl. Rodgers has yet to. This is one of Rodgers' absolute best chances. They had home field. They had it all working. The New York Giants ultimately rekindled their Super Bowl rivalry with the New England Patriots, beating them for a second time. Giants also became the first 9-win team, single-win team to win a Super Bowl. They were actually division champions, too. You and I kind of divulged and really looked into this Packers schedule. And similar to what we saw in this year's playoffs with the Minnesota Vikings, oddly enough, also losing to the New York Giants, it was maybe some soft spots on defense that we think could have been key here. Maybe a certain toughness that this Packer team didn't have that the previous Packer team did. Oddly enough, the Packers the previous year won them all on the road, similar to the New York Giants of 2007. So there's a lot of similarities here. But, yeah, one of the more disappointing finishes to a phenomenal season, because when you win 15 games, you're expected to be there. Bottom line, we flirted with putting in the Carolina Panthers, but we chose this team over them. And quite frankly, I think it's because of the MVP season that Rodgers had. Cam had it too. But I think part of our decision-making was also based on the power of their offense.
Yeah, and I mean, you're talking about a team that's where the narrative was born, in my opinion, that Aaron Rodgers can't win the big games at home in the playoffs. And where if the pressure's off and he's on the road, then he's a great quarterback, and that Packer team is deadly. And that's why a lot of people did not want to see them make the playoffs this year, you know, but it happened the way it happened. And since then, it's stood true. The Packers, when they host the playoffs, have been bad. And I believe that started back in that 2011 season, where I think they felt a little entitled. They had to work to get that Super Bowl, and they got there. You know, they faced a really tough Pittsburgh Steelers team, and they held on for the victory. But
what's pretty crazy is during my younger years, the Packers at one point never lost a playoff game in Lambeau, dating back to the 60s and during the Favre era. Brett Favre, towards the latter years of his Green Bay run, lost games to the Minnesota Vikings, led by Dante Culpepper, Mike Vick, and his Atlanta Falcons, Eli Manning, New York Giants, 07. And it seems like that kind of killed the mystique, as John Olson would say, our good friend and huge Packer fan. But to your point, the Packers have not been great in Lambeau in the playoffs, and it all started with that Mike Vick game. That was in the Favre era, bled into the Rodgers era. But, you know, when you talk about a franchise, and now in this interesting offseason where you have Rodgers being the story, to have those two great quarterbacks, one after the other, Favre and Rodgers, and to only come away with one Super Bowl each, you got to think that it was a failed opportunity for Green Bay on some level. Because when you get the one guy handing it to the next guy, you want 5, like what Montana and Young did. You don't want 1 like what Peyton and Luck did. You don't want 1 or 2 in this case. It's a bit of an underachievement no matter how you slice it.
You don't want 2, 1 being each, when one guy got 7. You know, there's that part too. And Big Ben got multiple. Eli got multiple, all during the same time frame, really. And you know, it's
hard not to view it as an underachievement, no matter how you cut it. You know, the Packers are the NFL through and through. This is a franchise who won the original 2. They won the final championships of pre-merger, and you know, they have the most NFL titles if you count the pre-merger along with the Lombardi trophies, but it's hard to say that in the Rodgers and Favre era, this team shouldn't have more. At 5, we've got the 92 San Francisco 49ers. It was Steve Young's second year as the Niners starter. He was kind of an embattled quarterback in Tampa, sat behind Joe Montana, came up big when called upon, but he was the man now. They were 14-2. Your Cowboys were 13-3. It was a heavyweight fight, but the Cowboys got them on the road. And in your opinion, you think this is one of the greatest 49er teams ever that fell short. Elaborate on what you think about this Niners team.
Well, you know, like you said, they were a 14-2 team. They were hosting that game. Dallas had 3 losses this year, some questionable losses, 2 of them being on the road. You look at the difference in this game really was the fact that it just was the 92 Dallas Cowboys, 93 Dallas Cowboys, 94 Dallas Cowboys, you know, and that's what it came down to. And that's why that rivalry was so great back then. But that's also what led to the eventual, all right, we need to get ourselves a Deion Sanders, you know, to be able to dethrone Dallas. But just that team, they were supposed to be there. It was supposed to be the 49ers and the Bills that year. But Dallas came in and took care of business. And it's not like it was a bad team. They were the 2 greatest teams in the NFC at the time. And
for the viewer, Deion did join the Niners 2 seasons later in 94. Mm-hmm. It was a short stay, but an effective one, as he did help them get over the hump against the Cowboys. As we alluded to on our honorable mentions, that 94 Cowboy team coming up short, going for a 3-peat. This Niners team, Steve Young was starting to get the reputation as a guy who couldn't get the monkey off his back, so to speak, and win that elusive Super Bowl, because you got to remember, this is a man who replaced the most polarizing quarterback of the 80s, Joe Montana, winning 4, going 4 for 4. And, you know, Rice was with Montana for 2 of those. Rice was with Young during this era. So, yes, the questions were starting to surround if Steve Young had what Montana did. Ultimately, 3 years after the fact, Young was finally able to get it done. But, yeah, definitely a crushing defeat. And while we're on the theme of the Niners, we're going to go 2 for 2 here. At number 4, we've got the 90 49ers. League MVP, Joe Montana. It was his final league MVP. Joe's season ended along with his teammates, but his ended a few minutes earlier as he had a career-altering injury at the hands of Leonard Marshall, The 49ers were still in position to bleed the clock out. All they needed to do was pick up a couple of first downs, run the clock down. This was a true defensive struggle where the Giants actually were able to pull out the win without scoring a touchdown, kicking 5 field goals. You don't see that very often. In the regular season, San Francisco beat them 7-3 on Monday Night Football. It was a defensive war. So again, in 8 quarters, the Giants did not score a touchdown on these 49ers. So I think it speaks to why I think this 49ers team was special. But in the end, Roger Craig fumbles, Lawrence Taylor recovers, Matt Barr for 3, and the win. Pat Summerall's iconic words, there will be no three-peat. But that's what the 49ers had on the line, attempting to be the first team to three-peat in the Super Bowl era. They fell short, and this is a game that I've said to you in the past, I feel shaped the future of the NFL in terms of the next dynasty, because I think it, to a level, expedited Dallas's run. Because I'm not 100% sure, with Montana coming off that MVP campaign, if there wasn't going to be a little more 49ers before there was a little more Dallas. We'll never know. But that is the way it goes. Even as the team we spoke on earlier, you know, how the Brady era started. It was an injury too. So sometimes that's how these things go.
That 1990s team, man. I mean, a 14-2 team getting ready to three-peat. Nothing against the Giants. They were at, 13-3 that year?
Yeah.
But
I think that was the big question. Can they beat the Niners?
That was it. And again, this was where the start of we want to see Buffalo and the 49ers started. It was, imagine it would have been that Super Bowl instead. And could Buffalo have won now? There's a lot of variables to look at in this one. But ultimately, we saw what I thought was a better coached, more physical Giants team win that one. And Locke could say beating someone twice in the same year is hard, beating someone 3 times in the same year, but losing 7-3, that's very similar to losing 38-35. That's the way I look at it.
One thing, like I said, and this is why I think this team was special, the New York Giants could not score a touchdown on them in 8 quarters. That says a lot.
That says a lot about that Niner team, and it says a lot about that Giant team.
Well, I do think that that Giant team was a little offensively challenged. But, great coaching can do some great things. But, it's also a credit to the Giants offense because this 49er offense was no joke. 7-3 and 15-13. Far from offensive explosions on either side. But the 49ers did crack pay dirt twice and once in each game. And
the Niners were undefeated at home.
That they were too. Yes. So that was another big part of this. Whereas the Giants did taste defeat at home to actually this team coming up next. The 1990 Buffalo Bills. This was the first of 4 consecutive appearances for this team. And as you look at the 4 consecutive AFC championships that they won, I think the consensus without question is that this 90 team was the best one the Bills had.
I mean, that team was good. It was the start of Jim Kelly, Thurman Thomas, Andre Reed in their prime with Bruce Smith on the defensive side, Cornelius Bennett. I mean, they had a team. On paper, they had a damn good team. And it was unfortunate what happened with them. Obviously they lost to the eventual Super Bowl champs and the Giants. But, it was supposed to be the Bills' year. That was supposed to be the game they won.
Yeah, I think it speaks volumes when you actually pick 2 teams from the same year. The Niners, then the Bills, 4-3 on this list. I think it says a lot about the quality of the teams that lost in the 1990 season. A couple of key points in this game that swung it. Obviously, Norwood missing the game-winning field goal is the ultimate thing. But there were other plays here. Jeff Hostetler avoided a safety in the end zone holding on to the football. If he drops that football, I think this game's out of reach, and I don't think the Giants recover, and I think they unleash the dogs. The connection with these two teams was earlier in the year, the Buffalo Bills ended Phil Simms' season. So this was backup quarterback Jeff Hostetler and a run-first mentality for the Giants and a time of possession mentality that kept the very dynamic offense of the Bills off the field. This Bills team scored just under 100 points in the playoffs going into this game. 2 blowout victories over Don Shula's Dolphins. And the next week, running up the score on a Bo Jackson-less Los Angeles Raider team because Bo's career ended during these playoffs too. This was a very eventful playoffs, the 1990 season was. Also, go ahead.
I was going to say, to put emphasis on Don Shula, we were talking about the 1968 Colts also, and Don Shula was the coach of that team.
Yes, he was.
He was the Dolphin, so, so the
yes,
greatness of who you're beating.
No, for sure. And Marv Levy's a great coach, and I have a lot of respect for him. You talked about Bill Belichick, his great defense. Bill Belichick came up big during this season with the New York Giants. It was his final game coaching as a member of the Giants. He went on to become the Cleveland Browns coach. Bill Belichick retired. Bill Parcells retired for a couple of years. Tom Coughlin went on to Boston College. So this was a changing of the guard for the New York Giants after winning this Super Bowl. Because at the end of this game, a lot of things changed for the Giants, and they did not get back to the big game for another decade. At number 2, we've got the Minnesota Vikings, one of the greatest offenses of all time, led by Chris Carter, Randy Moss, and Randall Cunningham, as well as a very underrated running back in Robert Smith. They had a great defense led by the great John Randall, and they had a great kicker in Gary Anderson, who did not miss a field goal all season. They lost to the Dirty Bird Falcons. Dan Reeves. Oh, boy. Dan Reeves ultimately played against friend-turned-foe in Mike Shanahan and his former team, the Broncos. But everybody, I remember this season, everybody from probably week 7 was like, it's going to be the Vikings, it's going to be the Broncos, and I think the Vikings are going to get them. Ultimately, the Broncos went back-to-back. That's how the season concluded. But this is the team that I believe should have won the Super Bowl. Zappy, what went wrong besides
Gary
O.J. Santiago? Yeah,
Gary Anderson.
Oh boy, yeah.
That's what it was. You're talking about a guy that didn't miss all season long, and then he misses in that game
at home.
It's
the old Metrodome. At the old Metrodome, unbelievable, man. Like
when I think of that team. When I think of a specific game about who that team was, I think about the Thanksgiving game that Minnesota came to Dallas where Randy Moss was torching our secondary. This is him as a rookie, as a damn rookie. That team was phenomenal. They were phenomenal, but it was a kicker, your most reliable kicker
and Gary Anderson is one of the all-time greats, but to miss that field goal in that situation. And I think the thing that where football fans lose is that the Atlanta Falcons were not on the level of the Denver Broncos and probably didn't belong there. And I think that was the biggest disappointment for football fans is that we missed out on what could have been a great Super Bowl. Instead, we got a very mediocre one with the Broncos winning with relative ease. And, the Dan Reeves curse continued into the Super Bowl. The man, unfortunately, could not win a Super Bowl. He was very good with us. He was great with the Broncos. He was pretty good with the Falcons. But unfortunately, he could never win the big one, similar to his peer, Marv Levy of Buffalo. At number 1, this is a team that doesn't have too much problem winning Super Bowls. The 2007 New England Patriots. At the time, the greatest offensive season of all time. Tom Brady breaking the touchdown records for the single season. Randy Moss doing the same in the receiving realm. The Patriots won 18-0 before one giant upset. This Patriot team, it just seemed like a fantasy and just a great carnival ride they beat a lot of good teams during the course of that season. They beat your Dallas Cowboys, who were very good that year.
They didn't beat. They beat.
Yeah. But when you look at the caliber of teams, this wasn't some paper champion that just got a good schedule. They beat a lot of quality teams. They beat the Steelers. They beat the Giants. They beat the Redskins. They beat a lot of playoff caliber teams. They beat the Colts. They were the team of destiny, essentially. And I do believe that what changed the trajectory of how this season ultimately ended had to be week 17 in Giant Stadium. Tom Coughlin making a decision on not benching his starters, although there was nothing to gain because the Giants had clinched the playoffs the week before with a victory in Buffalo. Giants were going to be a wild card no matter how it played out. Patriots were going for the undefeated 16-0. They had already crushed the Miami record because Miami was 14-0. So they had already beaten their regular season numbers, would eventually beat the overall number of the 17-0. But the Giants came to play. It was a shootout. It ultimately turned out to be a shootout where Eli Manning and Tom Brady were just in that kind of game, and Plaxico Burress and Randy Moss was shining. In the end, the more talented offense won, but I think this was a game where the Giants gained some invaluable confidence. And I think the Giants said that if we see these guys again, we could actually beat them. I don't know who else believed it, but the Giants believed it. They did get that chance. And I think what's the most intriguing thing about the rematch was that the score was 7-3 after the first quarter, and nobody scored again until the fourth quarter.
Mm-hmm.
And, David Tyree, the helmet catch, Michael Strahan's final game as a professional, the iconic sack on Tom Brady flexing his guns. And I will say this. I still think the Patriots were going to win. When you see Brady to Moss, which sets up.
Oh, my gosh.
Did anybody really think at that time that the Giants were going to be able to respond from that?
I don't think anyone had realized Tom Brady's strength until that play where, Randy Moss is streaking and somehow Brady still overthrew him. Imagine he makes that catch.
Well, that's the crazy thing because, David Tyree gave us a 10-7 lead. Late, Tom Brady to Moss puts them up 14-10. And that's when I thought it was the death nail for the Giants. I really did.
I thought it was, I still thought the Giants were going to be able to finish it off. I was very hopeful, I'll say that.
Well, I must admit, in the history of this sport and in the history of this game, this is undeniably the biggest knockout blow I've ever seen in terms of upset value.
Yeah, and it's crazy. The top two between the Vikings and the Patriots both include Randy Moss, who quite arguably is the most explosive player in NFL history.
Yeah, you can make that argument. I think on most people's list in terms of wide receivers, the only guy ahead of him would be Jerry Rice. Yeah. I don't think anybody else you could logically put ahead of Moss outside of Rice. Moss is comfortably my number 2.
Yeah, T.O. is in the conversation, but
for sure.
When you really break it down, there's no one you could put there. And really, Randy Moss became his own worst enemy as to why he didn't get to become the greatest wide receiver ever. We saw the off the field issues. We saw a lot of things get to him, and it eventually led to him going to the Raiders, then the Patriots, and the constant movement for the guy. And then he goes on and has the greatest NFL season by a wide receiver at the time with what him and Tom Brady did together. So it's just, like that team. I think if the Giants and Patriots had played 10 times, I think there was going to be one time the Giants won, and it was that one. To look at it that way, because that Patriots team was just an unbelievable team.
Yeah, it was remarkable. And I think New York was still feeling the sting of blowing a 3-0 lead to the Boston Red Sox just a few years earlier in 2004. And I think this was like something that New York needed after catching the sting.
Oh, man.
That was remarkable. I'm going to make a short little list here of some of the best performances of losers in the Super Bowl. Just about done here. But man, if it was anybody else, if it wasn't Tom Brady and Bill Belichick, I don't think they recover.
And you know what's crazy too? If it's Dallas in that Super Bowl or the Green Bay Packers, I think the Patriots win. I think they win that Super Bowl. So that's the other part of it too about this New York Giants.
They met their kryptonite. It was the right matchup, and the Giants were able to make that historic Patriot offense look very pedestrian, and I think that's the most impressive thing of all. I'm naming here just a few of the greatest games in a losing effort. I've got Kurt Warner, Tom Brady, Larry Fitzgerald, and Terrell Owens. Owens we mentioned in that Eagle game. Fitz and Warner together essentially losing to the Pittsburgh Steelers as a member of the Arizona Cardinals. That was the year after the game we just got done discussing. But, yeah, these are just a few. Tom Brady's performance in 2017 against the Philadelphia Eagles, some could argue that was Tom Brady's greatest Super Bowl performance, even though they lost. What did he do wrong? He didn't execute the Philly special, and he fumbled on the final offensive play of the game. But, I mean, outside of that, one could argue that Brady might have been better than Foles that day, but the Patriot defense just couldn't make a stop. Terrell Owens, remarkable what he did. And Kurt Warner, some would argue, should have 3 Super Bowls instead of 1. But against the Pittsburgh Steelers, his one true mistake was an interception before the half that James Harrison took to the house. It's unfortunate because the Warner to Fitzgerald go-ahead touchdown will not be remembered the way it should be because they lost the game. But I do believe that was an iconic Super Bowl play. Is there anybody else that I didn't list here that stands out to you or somebody you want to mention? I just realized that there is someone I want to mention too.
I think it's the same one I was going to say, Thurman Thomas.
Yes, sir. Thurman Thomas against my New York Giants. Yeah, he is your MVP if they win. Ultimately, Otis Anderson won the MVP. But Thurman Thomas, such an underrated talent during those times because just around the corner, he would run into another iconic running back in Emmitt Smith. And Emmitt Smith obviously would get more love because of the fact that the Cowboys were winning, where Thurman was always the bridesmaid. But I got to say, in that particular season, in that particular game, Thurman Thomas was the best running back in the NFL probably. But MVP-worthy performance coming up short. But, what I like about this list and what we did today here is that you've got just some iconic teams that I feel need to be mentioned because everybody seems to remember the winners. Nobody remembers the losers. But in order for these games to be as phenomenal as they are, you need that fight from the other guys that you did beat. And that's why these teams got mentioned. And these teams do deserve their place in history as well.
Yeah, the only other one I could think of that maybe like an honorable mention would be either Matt Ryan or Julio Jones, but I'm going to lean towards Julio because of the magnitude of that catch that should have sealed the win for them. But then they still blew that lead, because Matt Ryan was having a great performance in that Super Bowl, and Julio Jones, that catch I think of was incredible.
Yeah, I don't even have words for what happened there. That might be the biggest collapse in the history of the league. And then you couple that with this regular season where the Indianapolis Colts had a huge lead on the Minnesota Vikings, only to blow it, Matt Ryan being on the wrong side of that again. Speaking of the Vikings, before we get out of here, Brian Flores has been hired to be their new defensive coordinator. He will be replacing Ed Donatel. I think the last straw with the Vikings' patience for Ed Donatel was seeing what the New York Giants did to them in that high-scoring first-round matchup. But Flores is on the right track to being a head coach again. I was a little surprised. It's an upgrade for him in terms of his position, but I did think he was going to be in Pittsburgh a little longer because I initially thought that he was going to ultimately take over the job from Mike Tomlin.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing with Mike Tomlin is he might see something with this team. And because of that, the way they finished the year off, I think Brian Flores realized, all right, it's going to be a while. If this Steelers team did not finish the season the way they did, I think we'd be having a different conversation, honestly.
Quite possibly. We will be back. It's Super Bowl week, and that's why we are giving you all this Super Bowl content. We have some more shows that we want to go over, divulging into the greatest teams that won Super Bowls, as well as the greatest MVP performers. Until next time, he's Zappy. I am Richie.